I'm going to sort of speak informally today, and it's a little bit off the cuff, but I think it would be a more dynamic presentation just to kind of give you my thoughts on the state of affairs, the challenges that journalists confront around the world, the challenges to press freedom, and really the theme of my talk today is the U.S. role in shaping the global media landscape and the challenges that we face today, linking those challenges to some of the things that are happening here in this country. Before I begin, I think it would be appropriate to tell you a little bit about the Committee to Protect Journalists. I can't assume that all of you know about it. Raza was telling me that some of you happen to be watching the Golden Globes, I guess, when Meryl Streep gave us a shout out, and that sort of put us on the map. But actually, we've been doing this for nearly 4 decades, that is defending the rights of journalists around the world. And in places around the world where journalists are under threat, we're very well known. We didn't have the same kind of profile in the United States for very obvious reasons. My own background as I was a journalist in Mexico and Central America for over a decade. I covered the conflict in El Salvador and Guatemala, and also the rise of the Zapatista rebels in 1994 in southern Mexico. And then I started at the Committee to Protect Journalists, directing their Americas program, which focused on Latin America. Occasionally we got involved in some issues in the U.S. For example, threats against immigrant journalists. I took up the case of also a journalist from the New York Times who was threatened by the Russian mafia. So there is a history of these kinds of serious violent incidents in the United States, but they're relatively rare, and of course the legal framework in which journalists work in the United States is protected by the First Amendment. When CPJ was created, it was actually created in response to a very specific incident that occurred in 1980, I believe. There was a Paraguayan journalist named Alcibiades González del Valle, and he was a columnist for the leading newspaper in Paraguay, which was called ABC Color, the leading newspaper. And he wrote a critical column about the government there. It was under the dictatorship of Alfredo Stroessner. He was in the United States visiting as part of a State Department program, and he learned while he was in the United States that he would face arrest when he went home. So as he was kind of traveling around the United States and visiting newsrooms, he was mentioning this, and a bunch of journalists got together and they said, hey, if anything happens to you, there's not a heck of a lot we can do. We're journalists, but at least we can cover it. And sure enough, he went back to Paraguay, and not long after he arrived there, he was arrested, and there was this flurry of international coverage. The New York Times did a story, the agencies did a story, and the government of Alfredo Stroessner, which thought it could kind of do this and nobody would pay attention, they were suddenly in the global spotlight, and they were back on their heels, and eventually he was released. And from that model of journalists defending journalists and using the privileged position we have in the United States to stand up on behalf of our colleagues, CPJ was born. And now we've institutionalized that structure. We have specialists who work in different regions of the world. We are deployed internationally. We have a highly visible and prestigious board of directors who amplify our advocacy. But the basic structure in some ways remains the same, which is that we have the unique ability to mobilize the media on behalf of press freedom and the rights of journalists. And that ability to mobilize the media puts pressure on institutions and governments and other forces that have the ability to take remedial action. But what's changed in the 30 or so years that we've been at this, of course, is the entire media structure. The media as an institution is much more diversified, much less concentrated. That has many disadvantages, of course, in terms of kind of its democratized information, but it also means that those powerful institutions are actually less powerful. And the other thing that's changed, that's also of critical importance, is the United States and the role of the United States. One of the strategies that was deployed in the early years of the human rights movement, so in the 1980s, was to try and orient U.S. foreign policy by generating media coverage. And in those days, you could get an editorial in the New York Times, and that editorial would have tremendous influence on U.S. policies, for example, in Central America. That's almost laughable to think about today. Obviously, to shift U.S. policies and shift perceptions globally, you can't just rely on one media organization. It's a diversified landscape, and you have to be able to mobilize across that diversified landscape. And then the influence of one particular government, particularly the United States, is much diminished. So it's a much more complex environment in which to carry out this kinds of advocacy, but the basic structure and the basic strategy remains in place. In order to introduce you to CPJ, I'm going to show you a short video. We have this big gala celebration where we honor heroic journalists from around the world who put their lives on the line to report the news, and we use this as an opportunity to introduce ourselves to this audience. So the video I'm about to show you is a bit of CPJ propaganda, immodestly, but I hope it gives you a sense of the work that we do. 2018 has been one of the darkest periods in our history.
I was traumatized. Inside a concrete box, no content within inside the room.
As soon as he entered the building, he was strangled, dismembered, and disposed of in 2 ISIS bombings.
9 journalists are among those killed.
NYPD is now investigating a suspicious package.
Journalists are facing jail in Myanmar.
Multiple people reported shot.
5 killed, all of them journalists.
I was photo. You're from the books and you've nowhere to go.
Fake news! You are the enemy of the people.
So, pushed up. And that's what it did. And who CPJ was out there?
You are completely knocked out by this constant barrage of attack. He was somebody you can turn to. That's what CPJ has been doing.
People were fighting on Mandela.
Thank God that today I'm regaining my freedom.
Jailing a journalist is a brutal form of censorship.
One political prisoner is one too many. You have the power to actually remedy this injustice today.
Journalism matters to people all over the world. The journalists themselves are counting on us, and they know that we're relentless and we're not going to give up. One of the things that CPJ is known for and that shapes all of our advocacy globally is our research. We're an organization of journalists. Most of us have worked as journalists, and so we deploy the tools of journalism to defend the rights of our colleagues around the world who live in places where they face repression and violence. And one of the things that we do every year is we document journalists killed around the world, and we also document journalists imprisoned around the world. And I want to get into the data for a moment and talk about some of the trends that we've seen. I think if you look at this graph, you can sort of see some tendencies. So the question becomes, why are journalists killed and under what circumstances? A lot of these peaks on this graph correspond to conflict. So when there is an ongoing conflict, particularly a global conflict which attracts large numbers of journalists, not surprisingly, you see a spike in the number of journalists killed. So some of the peaks we see correspond to a shift in the security environment. That's one of the things that increases the risk dramatically for journalists, and that is a circumstance in which journalists are killed. A relatively small percentage, less than a third, are killed in crossfire incidents. So the kind of what you might expect in a conflict. In other words, you're covering a firefight and you're hit by a bullet or you step on a landmine. That certainly happens. In fact, most journalists who are killed are murdered, and they're targeted. Roughly, historically, about 2/3. So the generalized violence of conflict provides the cover for violent forces which seek to silence journalists to actually single them out and target them. And most journalists who are killed in retaliation for specific coverage. And that coverage often includes politics, human rights, corruption. So journalists who are investigating powerful forces in violent societies and lawless societies are the most vulnerable to violence, and that's what you see in these spikes. Another thing that I want to point out about our data, about 90% of all journalist murders are carried out with impunity. That means the people who carry it out get away with it and are able to use violence and the threat of violence to censor and control information at a global level. Okay, now let's look at the graph of journalists in prison worldwide, and that's an even more troubling graph. You'll see that we had a sort of trough in the late 1990s. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, you saw an explosion of press freedom around the world. You saw that the sort of systems of control and information management that had been part of the Soviet system collapsed in Eastern Europe and in other parts of the world, and you saw an explosion of independent journalism. You also saw some violent conflict in the Balkans. That's why you see that little spike there. And then something happened in 2001. And we all know what that was in terms of events in this country, the September 11th attacks. But what was interesting was that when the United States began to reframe the response as a war on terror, you saw governments around the world embrace that rhetoric and define critical journalism as essentially supporting terrorism. And you saw a global crackdown on freedom of the press. That's where you see this spike to about 118. Then it kind of levels off a bit. And then in 2012, you see the Arab Spring. And that was a sort of wake-up call for governments around the world that independent information was a threat to their power. And then you see another crackdown. And it's another escalation. As I said, there are a variety of factors that contribute to them. But I want to mention one, and that's this. So the new framework that we're seeing for repression around the world is the embrace of some of the Trumpian rhetoric around fake news. According to CPJ data, in 2016, 9 journalists were in jail around the world on what we call false news charges. That's what we've been documenting historically. That number more than doubled, went up to 21. And we've seen governments around the world, not just in terms of the kinds of charges they're lodging against journalists, but the overall rhetoric that they use to justify repression, embrace this term of fake news. It's a gift to autocratic leaders. You see promulgation of fake news laws. You see autocratic leaders from Duterte in the Philippines to Putin to Maduro in Venezuela to government in Singapore to Malaysia is another example where this fake news rhetoric has been embraced by the political leaders and used as a basis to justify repression and censorship. So this is a global phenomenon. One thing I wanted to mention actually in the last slide, which I skipped over, but I want to come back to. So today is actually the 1-year anniversary of 2 amazing journalists from Reuters who've been in prison now for a year. They are Walon and Hwasou. They're 2 journalists who work for Reuters in Myanmar. And they produced an explosive investigation on the murder of Rohingya Muslims in Rakhine State carried out by a Buddhist paramilitary group. And they were able to obtain photographs that showed brutal execution of these villagers, basically in collaboration by their fellow villagers. And these photos were then provided, and the reporting were part of the Reuters team. Reuters used this information. They were preparing a story, and the Burmese military knew that this story was going to be published, and they basically set them up. They gave these journalists they invited them to dinner. They gave these journalists some documents that were basically planted, and then they arrested them immediately after they left this restaurant where they met. They've now been convicted in Myanmar under the Colonial Era Official Secrets Act. They've been sentenced to 7 years in prison. There's been a high level of global indignation and outrage in response to this terrible injustice, and today they've been imprisoned for a year. So I'm going to give you a peek of 2018 data. So what we do in order to prepare this snapshot, we call it a census of journalists in prison, is we pick a date. So it's December 1st, and we do a kind of a global census of journalists in prison everywhere in the world. And this is a huge undertaking that involves all of our staff because you have to figure out, these are repressive countries that are not open about their judicial processes, so you have to dig into the legal paperwork, you have to do your reporting. So it's quite a substantial undertaking. And we were able to document 251 journalists in prison around the world, so that's not a record. But what it suggests is that these high numbers that we've seen over the last couple of years have now become a sort of semi-permanent feature of the press freedom landscape. The countries that top the list, so Turkey is the world's leading jail of journalists, followed by China, followed by Egypt. Those are the 3 leading jailers of journalists. Together they account for about half of all journalists in prison around the world. The situation is relatively stable in both Turkey and China, but it's actually worsened in Egypt. And one of the things we're seeing, remember I mentioned that fake news rhetoric and framing, well, the country that's probably taken the greatest advantage of that is Egypt, under the government of Sisi. And Egypt has promulgated a new fake news law that has actually not yet been signed into law, but probably will be imminently, which basically classifies anyone who has more than 5,000 followers on social media as a media outlet subject to the country's law on fake news, under which many journalists have already been prosecuted and jailed. Most of those journalists also face other charges, but the number of journalists jailed around the world on false news charges, we call them false news because that's how we document it historically, has continued to rise. So that's another troubling development, which suggests the extent to which this kind of rhetoric is being embraced by autocratic leaders. The number of journalists who have been murdered is up from last year. It's 52. So that's not historic, it's slightly below the historic highs, but again, we're seeing consistently high levels of media repression. If you look at our data of journalists killed and imprisoned, and again, this has become something of a permanent feature. What's really interesting and alarming about the data for this year is we've actually seen a sharp increase in the number of journalists murdered. And we don't quite know why this is. We don't quite know why there were 18 journalists murdered in 2017, 19 the year before, and this year there are 33. And we don't quite understand why this is, but I will make a couple points. One thing that contributed to this was the murder of the journalist from the Capital Gazette in Maryland. I'm sure many of you remember this terrible incident which occurred earlier this year when you could call him a disgruntled reader. He had a long-standing grievance with the newspaper because it had reported on it was a sort of a legal procedure around an issue of harassment, physical harassment in a kind of some sort of relationship. And this person was angry that the paper reported on this and had threatened the paper and engaged with the paper, and finally he decided to go into the newsroom and start shooting. He killed 4 journalists and a sales assistant, a media worker. So 4 journalists were killed in the United States this year. There's actually another journalist who was murdered in Chicago named Zach Stoner, who was a sort of hip-hop blogger. We are looking into that case. We don't know if he was killed for his journalism. We consider that case to be under investigation, but at least 4 journalists were killed in the United States, which actually puts the U.S. in 3rd place as most murderous country for journalists behind Afghanistan, Syria, and tied with Mexico. So that's a pretty alarming development. Of course, the incident that has really shocked the world and sort of galvanized attention and focus on this issue is the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist and Washington Post columnist who was killed inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul by a hit team deployed from Riyadh, we believe, on the orders of the Crown Prince. There's an increasing amount of evidence to suggest that his personal involvement. And this murder, I think for a number of reasons. One, because of the prominence of Khashoggi himself and the fact that so many journalists knew him and the fact that he was a Washington Post columnist, and the extensive media coverage that resulted from the murder. Plus the fact that the Turkish government, which as I mentioned, Turkey's the world's leading jailor of journalists, so this is deeply ironic, has kind of carried out this investigation and leaked information at a kind of steady rate, which has kind of engaged the media and kept the story alive. They have their own particular reasons for doing this. And then I think it's just the intimacy and horror of this crime. You know, the bone saw and the fact that this team was sent, you know, with the specific instruction to carry out this murder, that they were obviously very professional, and that we know so many details about what happened, I think has really galvanized public attention, which is, I think, the one small silver lining to come out of what is unquestionably a horrific event. So let's talk about the United States for a second. One of the things, as I mentioned, CPJ, you know, historically, we've been focused on places around the world where journalists are most vulnerable, most under threat, where the threat is of life and limb. And for the most part, that's not true in the United States. And one of the things we found during the Trump campaign and the heightened, basically ran a campaign against the media, the heightened anti-media rhetoric. So when he came into office, there was a tremendous amount of concern, understandably, about what would be the implications for press freedom in the United States. And one of the things we found was there wasn't a systematic effort to collect and document these violations. And so we formed a coalition with about 30 other groups led by one group called the Freedom of the Press Foundation, which is based in San Francisco, to create a website and database to actually track press freedom incidents in the United States and create a baseline. One of the things, as I mentioned, we're an organization of journalists, so our framework for the advocacy that we do is always to ensure the integrity of the information and to ensure that there's systematic documentation. And so that's one of the things we wanted to do. And so we created a database and a website. And so in the first year, we documented 120 cases. So this was in 2017, in that calendar year. 34 arrests of journalists. Now, we don't have a baseline. We don't know how many were arrested the year before, but that number really surprised us. And one of the things that we found was that these arrests took place at demonstrations. So there were a lot of political demonstrations. You'll remember there were demonstrations in Ferguson. There were demonstrations protesting Trump inauguration. And the police have applied very aggressive tactics to controlling crowds at those demonstrations. And some of those aggressive tactics have ensnared journalists. Now, here's the other thing, 44 physical attacks. So here's the thing that's really alarming. A lot of those physical attacks also took place at demonstrations. And they were often on the part of the protesters. So if you were a journalist covering a demonstration, you were worried about the protesters who were angry at the media because in many cases they believed that they were portrayed unfairly or they were Antifa demonstrators who didn't want their pictures taken. And for a variety of reasons, they didn't want the media around, which you would think that if you're holding a public protest, the whole point is to attract attention, which includes the media, but there's so much animosity and hostility towards the media that sometimes it was reflected. And then the police who are employing these very aggressive tactics to control crowds. So that was something we're very alarmed by. But I want to focus on this 20 journalists subpoenaed. What does that say about the legal environment, which there were a lot of concerns about that. You'll remember that during the campaign, Trump spoke about making it easier to sue journalists. That was one of his campaign promises, which thankfully he has not been able to fulfill because we do still have the First Amendment and we do still have jurisprudence which makes that virtually impossible. And it also is libel law is basically something that is at the state level, so even if Trump wanted to make it easier to sue journalists, I don't think he could be successful. But there have been legal developments which are very alarming. During the Obama administration, there was a trend towards aggressive leak investigations. And you'll remember that there was a deep concern within the Justice Department about leaks during the Obama administration because we had the first tranche of WikiLeaks and we had Snowden revelations. And so the Obama administration adopted a very aggressive posture in terms of prosecuting leakers. And they used this 1917 law called the Espionage Act, which was basically intended to criminalize espionage, people who provided intelligence to foreign adversaries. But the theory that the Obama administration applied that was very troubling was that making information public, in other words, leaking classified information and making it available to the media was a form of espionage. That troubled us a great deal, and the Obama administration actually pursued 8 such charges under the Espionage Act during their administration, which was more than during all previous administrations combined. Now, during the Trump administration, we've actually now seen 5 investigations under the Espionage Act, so we were very concerned about the situation during the Obama administration. But actually, I think 4 of them are under the Espionage Act, and one of them is under a slightly different theory. But these are of these 20 subpoenas, 4 involve the Espionage Act, and the 5th is related to the Espionage Act. So the environment under Trump is equally troubling. We had an Attorney General in Jeff Sessions who, when he was going through the confirmation hearings, basically said under the Obama administration there were these guidelines that the Justice Department put in place which limited the circumstances in which journalists could be subpoenaed. And Sessions indicated he was not disposed to accept that framework, or he wouldn't commit publicly to doing so. And there were also reports that there were many more leak investigations that were underway under the Trump administration. So we don't know where that stands. We don't know how many leak investigations there are. But we do know we've seen a number of subpoenas and a number of charges filed and successful prosecutions. And so the legal environment is deeply troubling. So let me go back now and link what we're seeing globally to what's happening in the United States. During the campaign, Trump was asked on Morning Joe about the killings of journalists in Russia. And watch this.
He's running this country, and at least he's a leader, unlike what we have in this country.
Yeah, again, he kills journalists that don't agree with him.
Well, I think our country does plenty of killing also, Joe.
It is certainly true that many journalists are killed in Russia and that many critics of Putin are killed. And it's true that Vladimir Putin seems to be personally indifferent to these killings. I'm not sure that we can say at this point that he's directly responsible. But nevertheless, this has been an area of historic concern for the United States, the murders of journalists around the world. And during the campaign, in this response, Trump made clear that he was utterly indifferent to the murders of journalists. And I think this set a really powerful tone and message to press freedom violators around the world and the adversaries of journalists and free expression that an administration, once Trump was victorious, was coming into office that was indifferent and even contemptuous of the role that journalists have historically played in defending and safeguarding and sharing information and their role in maintaining the global information order in which we all depend. And I think this message was incorporated and has had a significant impact on the behavior of autocratic governments around the world when it comes to journalists. And let me talk about some of the ways in which I think this has been manifest. First of all, the U.S. has had a very imperfect record on press freedom domestically. And it has selectively stood up for press freedom and the rights of journalists around the world historically. But it has been a key value and a key principle, and it has been an important element in U.S. foreign policy. Certainly, President Bush, when a prominent journalist, Anna Politkovskaya, was murdered in Russia, he raised his concern directly with President Putin. When an American journalist, Daniel Pearl, was murdered in Pakistan back in 2001, the Bush administration certainly put tremendous pressure on the Pakistani government to achieve justice in that case. That effort was only partially successful, but at the time, there have been many murders of journalists in Pakistan. There had not been a successful prosecution. Subsequently, there has been one of a Pakistani journalist. But again, this was a kind of principle. And if a journalist was murdered and that journalist had a connection to the U.S. media, certainly. But even if they didn't, there was a pretty good chance that it would be a part of the bilateral discussions with that head of state. So Trump has completely abdicated that responsibility. There is no evidence whatsoever that he has raised press freedom with any of the countries around the world which are the worst jailers of journalists. In fact, here he is with President Sisi, who visited the White House not long after he was inaugurated. He visited with President Xi of China and President Erdogan of Turkey, the three leading jailers of journalists as far as we can tell. Press freedom and the imprisonment of journalists was not on the agenda for any of those meetings. The rhetoric. So the rhetoric. We talked a little bit about the fake news framing and how destructive that's been on a global level. The kind of retort of enemies of the people has also been embraced. It's had a tremendous impact in terms of polarizing the media in this country and undermining public confidence and trust in the media. But it's also empowered autocratic leaders. I can think of a couple of examples. You had President Erdogan in Turkey basically call a CNN reporter who was asking an aggressive question fake news. I just was watching a video clip of the president of Uganda, Museveni. Journalists got up at a press conference, asked an impertinent question, and he was speaking to him in the way that Trump might speak to Jim Acosta. And again, all of that kind of response from autocratic leaders has become normalized by Trump's rhetoric. So that's another way. And you have to remember that the White House press briefing room is a bit of theater. I don't think a lot of news gets made there, but people watch that around the world, the way that the media interacts with the president, and they take on board the way in which those interactions occur, and that becomes sort of internalized. The response to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist who I just spoke about, has been absolutely disheartening. Trump has sort of occupied every position along the continuum, changing constantly. But there is one line that he's not willing to cross, and that is confronting the Crown Prince. There are all sorts of theories about why this is. Business relationships. He's tried to frame it as a strategic relationship that he needs to preserve, and an economic relationship that he needs to preserve. But with the White House, the official statement that the White House put out about the Khashoggi murder, which was clearly dictated by Trump, in which he said, the truth was unknowable, and that the relationship was more important than the single individual, was sent a powerful, powerful message to autocratic leaders around the world and to those who might use violence to restrict the work of the media. The failure to speak out about the importance of journalism in American political life and its value, particularly in the aftermath of the Capitol Gazette killing. I mean, you'll recall after this person burst into the newsroom, killed 5 people, Trump didn't immediately condemn it. Eventually, I think he said something along the lines of nobody should be killed at work, which of course is true, but really did not recognize the particular role that journalists play in our society, in democratic life, and the vulnerabilities they have, covering the communities of which they're a part. So that was incredibly disappointing. As I mentioned, I think his language fuels polarization and distrust of the media, undermining, and he's admitted this. He actually admitted in an interview, he was asked by Leslie Stahl of 60 Minutes, why do you constantly disparage the media? And he said, I do it to undermine all of you so that when you write a critical story, no one will believe you. So this is a deliberate strategy. It might produce some limited political benefit for him, but of course it undermines democratic life and, again, has global repercussions. He failed to exercise U.S. influence around the world, as I mentioned, and stand up for these values and incorporate press freedom and respect for the rights of journalists into U.S. foreign policy and multilateral relationships. I wrote a book a couple of years ago where I talked about the rise of a new generation of autocrats, which I call democratators. These are democratically elected autocrats. So basically, they're people like Erdogan, like Putin, like Hugo Chavez, like Viktor Orban in Hungary, who are elected with popular support. And their basic argument is, look, I was elected with the support of the people. And there are these institutions that are not democratically elected. Nobody elects the media. Nobody elects the courts. And they're trying to restrain power. Therefore, they are thwarting the will of the people. Therefore, they must be resisted. And that is the justification they use for restricting the media. Now, Trump, you could call Trump a wannabe democratator because he doesn't really have the power to exercise these impulses. And the institutions, which is something we'll talk about in a minute, have resisted. But I think that he has empowered those who believe in this model, and makes it much more difficult for the U.S., again, to exert influence in a positive direction. Another factor which I think is not directly attributable to Trump, but is related to the global environment, is the decline in European influence. So as I mentioned, you have a rise of these new generation of autocrats in Hungary and Poland. There have been a number of murders of journalists in Europe. So there's a press freedom crisis in Europe. You've got Brexit. So the ability of the European Union and individual states in Europe to exercise influence on a global context is more limited. And then one thing I want to also mention is I think that Trump's framing, and really, and to a certain extent, events in the United States and the concern, the legitimate concern about misinformation and propaganda, particularly the way the Russians have tried to exploit this opportunity, have kind of warped the debate around the information space, particularly the global information space, i.e. the internet. And so there's a pressing and overwhelming concern with managing and controlling information in order to ensure the legitimacy of democratic processes, but that should always have a clause like, how do we ensure that people have access to reliable and accurate information without violating our freedom of the press? Because I think the framing now, there's so much concern about creating a safer and more secure information space that some of the values at the heart of the internet, i.e. respect for free expression, are under threat. So I know I've presented a pretty depressing picture. I apologize. I wish it were otherwise. It's really out of my hands. But I do want to end on a more positive note. Some of you may have seen that Time magazine named the Guardians of the Truth, the Person of the Year. And the journalists that are pictured here, Maria Ressa, who was a journalist in the Philippines who founded an amazing website called Rappler that is confronting the government of Duterte, exposing corruption and human rights violation and facing systematic persecution as a result. The staff of the Capital Gazette that I mentioned. You know, one of the things that's amazing about Time magazine, it's a bit of a relic today, but you know, the form of journalism that Time has historically done is to kind of over-report, to send these teams of reporters to do huge amounts of research on a particular topic. And then they send, this is for those of us who grew up in a different era, they send what are called files. This is, you know, they're just detailed write-ups of what they reported. And those go back to an editor in New York who would write up those files into one comprehensive and cohesive narrative that brought in all these threads. So sometimes reading a Time magazine article was a really rewarding experience just for this reason that it was very good at bringing in lots of information and kind of identifying the key elements. And people rarely read Time magazine. It doesn't shape the kind of media agenda but once a year, when it comes out with a Person of the Year, everyone kind of looks at it. And if you haven't read this article, I really recommend it because it really sort of brings together all the threads that I've been talking about. The linking what's happening in the United States to what's happening around the world. The role of these frontline journalists. Remember that journalism involves real people who are out there gathering and disseminating information and creating this global information system. And those individuals, at the end of the day, it's those individuals who are exceedingly vulnerable, and we depend on them. We depend on them because there are fewer and fewer media organizations sending out journalists around the world to report the news, and because even in this country, the way that the information space is structured means that there's fewer journalists covering local events, and so we really depend on this new system, and it all has to kind of, it's a little bit jerry-rigged, and it all has to work together for us to be informed. But it got me thinking, you know, is this, you know, in the response to the Khashoggi murder, the kind of growing awareness about the threats to press freedom, that you know, the kind of visibility that CPJ has and our issues have, which have always been, you know, focused on protecting journalists in the most vulnerable places, that maybe what we're seeing now is a bit of a historic recalibration or historic correction, like the kind we saw after Watergate. There's always a dynamic in which powerful figures, you know, take on the media. And the media is an easy punching bag because you know, there's always a level of mistrust in the media, and they're always, you know, if you're a powerful political figure and your base supports you and you attack the media, your base is going to be galvanized by that. But the problem with that strategy, at least in an environment in which the person exercising it doesn't have the ability to actually carry out the repressive actions that might take place in a country like Pakistan or Turkey or Russia, is that eventually the media as an institution has the ability to kind of absorb a lot of these blows and continue to do its work. And that work is sort of cumulative. And I think, maybe I'm being optimistic, but I think that we are at a moment now where people in this country, and certainly people around the world, are beginning to think about what's at stake, about the very system of information that we've constructed, and about the ways in which the threats need to be resisted. And they recognize the heroic figures who we've always elevated, who are putting their lives and liberty on the line to bring us the news. Obviously, they're not all heroic. If you have an environment where there is free expression, there are going to be people who abuse it. But there are people who truly believe in the power of journalism, who truly believe in serving the public and using journalism to hold the powerful accountable. And I certainly am sober when I look out across the landscape and see what's happening. But I am also optimistic because I've never seen the kind of engagement and public response that we're witnessing today. So I'll end on that note. Thank you so much.